for.
I remember what it was like being out, and I remember like the feeling of the tooth getting pulled, like each tooth getting pulled, but like not registering that that's what it was at the time.
Okay. So you weren't full sedation? You weren't like general anesthetic? You were general anesthetic? Okay.
I can still register it.
You can still, yeah. Yeah, that's the, anybody who's ever getting your wisdom teeth out, a lot of you are at the age where you might need to get them, strongly recommend getting knocked out for it. Do not do it without anesthesia. Well, mine were impacted, so, yeah, so they had to like saw through my jawbone while I was awake, and it was awful. Yeah, see, I was awake. I was awake the whole time just with Novocaine. That was it. So yeah, that was. Oh yeah, exactly. And we talk in cognitive about that. I think we talk about certain smells we register once and we remember them vividly. The smell of saw through bone is a smell that you will recognize instantaneously, and it's not like one of those things. Like sometimes we sit there and say, "Well, I'll never forget that event." We experience that. That's a qualitative perception of that. That's what we call flashbulb memory. But the reality is those memories fade just like other memories do. But certain types of memories that are associated with certain things that are smell, those things actually we see that those are things that you're not likely to forget. That experience of I know that smell is I know that smell because there's something about it that actually forms a strong memory. That's like if you smell something like that's grandma's apple pie. I remember that from when I was 8 years old, standing in Grandma's kitchen. It's probably the smell of Grandma's apple pie, because that we tend to encode those more accurately. Yeah?
You recognize the smell, but not like recognize what it is. Like I know that smell, but I don't.
Yeah, like you know that you've experienced it before, but you don't remember what the source of it is. Yeah, I'm sure that you have that ability, just like you can have I've seen that before, but not know the source of it. Yeah. You know? Speaking of IVs in general, anesthesia, and to make it on a more grim note, but I like to start off days more grim. And it is relevant to discussions that we're having in Washington State here as well. But did you hear about what happened last night? I believe it was Missouri, where they attempted to execute a prisoner. Well, they attempted to, he didn't die from the execution, let me put it that way. They attempted to, we do most executions nowadays by lethal injection, okay? And lethal injection is basically a combination of a variety of drugs that are given to an individual that have different effects on different body functions, okay? A few years back, the manufacturer of one of the drugs decided to stop manufacturing the drug. And so with that, there was an arms race there was, and I don't mean to be facetious here, but there was basically two courses of action that was taken. There was the stockpiling of the drug, okay, which guess what state did the most of that? Texas. Texas went out there and basically, it's like what's going on with that codeine cough syrup. Now that it's getting pulled off the shelves, all those kids that are using it illegally are trying to buy as much as they can now, right? That's basically what Texas did, is they hoarded as much as they could because they said, we got a stockpile of people waiting to kill. We need to make sure we have the resources to kill them. And then there was, okay, can we develop other ways to kill people that don't rely on this drug from this pharmaceutical company? And so they tried to develop different concoctions that would work, but the problem is sometimes you have problems. And last night, in trying to execute an individual there, the drugs didn't work as well as they wanted them to. And basically, the individual went into uncontrollable seizures on the bed. They exploded one of his veins, and he basically died from a heart attack, not from the effects of the execution. And he died from a heart attack after the doctor on site decided to abort the execution attempt. So your discussion of injection and the IV and general anesthesia, I just think it's relevant to keep that in mind of what it means when we execute somebody, right? Like, what's the process here? We think lethal injection is a painless way to go. We think that and it's not. And we see plenty of evidence in recent years of these botched executions. right? When in reality, probably the best way to execute somebody, and I know this is a morbid way, okay, to talk about, but the best ways to execute somebody are the old-fashioned ways of doing it. That's why they were done, right? Shoot somebody, firing squad, that's one of the most effective ways to execute somebody. Hanging, if it's from a high enough drop, is one of the best ways to execute somebody. But the electric chair and lethal injection, horrible. There's many cases of botched executions using the electric chair. And those are ones that you just don't even want to, I won't even tell you about them because they're so graphic and horrible. I've never actually watched The Green Mile. No, I've never watched it. You know what else I saw, though, this morning looking at the standings? The Yankees are still in first place, and the Mariners are still in second to last with only the Astros behind them. And the Astros are basically like a AA affiliate, right? So that's the other thing I noticed. And the Yankees are in first place, and who else is in that division? You might know. Who else is in that division? And I know you know. Who else is in that division? I know. Not in that division. Right? Baltimore, Toronto, Tampa Bay, and there's this one other one. Boston, right? So there's a few people here that are Boston fans. But all right. Well, anyway, I mentioned that just because, as some of you might know, Governor Inslee has put a moratorium on executions here in Washington. Okay, so people who are on death row, Governor Inslee says nobody will be executed while he's governor. Okay, and his goal is to actually get the legislature to consider, and his goal is to get them to pass a complete abolition of the death penalty as an option here in Washington State. Okay, so I mentioned that in the sense of it's going to become public discussion here in the next couple years. Many states have recently started to change. I don't want to get into too much detail on this, but read up on it, educate yourself on it, make an educated decision. I'm not going to tell you what to believe, but find out about it because you're going to be voting for people who are going to be making decisions about what we're going to do regarding the death penalty here in Washington State in the next couple of years. I guarantee you that there's going to be a bill that's going to come up at some point in time that's going to try to abolish the death penalty, and it's going to be up to the legislature to decide whether they're going to pass that bill or whether they're not going to pass that bill. So get yourself educated on what it entails, what are the facts of it, and go from there. So I'm off the soapbox, but it was relevant given the guy. It was salient given what I saw last night and then what you mentioned there. Okay? All right, moving on from here. Let's talk about finishing up chapter, what chapter is this, 5? Okay, we're talking. I will get feedback to everybody on that as soon as possible. Okay, I had an exam on Monday for my other class that I'm in the process of grading on those, and I saw all of these here. I did a quick look over them. So it looks like everybody met the standard of the assignment, right? Does that make sense? But as far as going in and really critiquing the content, I haven't gotten to doing that yet, okay? But I will get to that back to you as soon as possible, all right? All right, so let's finish up talking about chapter 5 here. And then next class, we're going to be beginning the next chapter on chapter 6, which is, that chapter is on what Hastie and Dawes called explanation-based judgments, okay? And really what we're going to be looking at in that chapter, one of the things we're going to be looking at, and I'm going to give you an extra reading, so be on the lookout for an extra reading on something called the story model. All right? And we're going to see that a lot of these things are building on one another, even though we're talking about like some of these heuristics are heuristics meant to assess an estimate or a probability of something. We're going to see that the basic foundation, and maybe we should review this, what is the basic premise of the availability heuristic? That we make judgments on others by doing what? By relying on our memory, right? And not just relying on our memory, but we trust our memory. We pull examples from memory. We compare something that we're given with something that we have stored in memory, right? And we're going to see that in the representativeness heuristic is a direct similarity comparison. Right? But we're going to see a lot of that basic approach as being pervasive in all of our decision making, right? When we make decisions, we're relying on information we already have to help with those decisions. And so we're relying on our memory. We're going to be relying on our expectations. We're going to see that with the representativeness heuristic here in a little bit later today. And so when you're reading for chapter 6, as you read that, keep that in mind, that this is it's a memory phenomenon. Although we're talking about decision making relies on memory. And so these are memory phenomena where we're taking our knowledge and our expectations of the world and we're using that to assist us with developing an explanation for something that helps us then make the appropriate decision. Okay? And so one of those things that's going to be talked about there in that chapter and what I'm going to give you a supplemental reading on is something called the story model. And the story model is, as it sounds, it's a model about how we construct stories to explain something. And then we use those stories as the basis for our decision. Okay? And specifically the area that the story model was developed for, in which the most research has been done on, although it's a limited amount of research, is looking at how jurors make decisions. And so we'll talk about it in that context. And part of the reason why we'll talk about it in that context is because that's what it was written for. And also the individual who developed the story model is Reed Hasty, who is the author, one of the authors of your textbook. So we're going to be looking at some of what he originally wrote about the story model and trying to understand that as the basis for getting a broader understanding of those explanation-based judgments. Because we're going to be looking just in the jury area, but it's going to expand out to any area in which we're making a decision about, he said, she said. Who do you believe? Well, how many sides of a story are there? As many as there are people. And there's usually at least 3, right? Those 3 are what? Exactly, right? And so our job then is to sit there and try to develop what those are and then assess that in some way to determine which one we believe the most, because that's going to lead us to the appropriate decision in that context. And so that's what that chapter is going to be focusing on there. Hand. Did I? Yeah, I probably was, but I'm trying to remember what it was now. I apologize. I just got here, literally, because I had to drop my kids off at daycare this morning. So I haven't been here since 5 like I usually am. So I haven't prepped all this pre-class stuff that I usually do. Extra credit, one thing I can say, I don't remember the exact percentages, but very few of you have taken up the opportunity for extra credit so far. In fact, I know that the number, not including if you did it yesterday afternoon, okay, is 3. Okay, 3 of you have taken the opportunity for extra credit, not including yesterday afternoon. So if you did it yesterday afternoon, add that to the number, okay? Which puts us at roughly about 9% of the class has taken the opportunity for extra credit. I'm not forcing you to take it, but I just want to point out that if you don't, you may run out of the opportunities because we are keeping it open for you and other psych students exclusively for the remainder of this week and early into next week. And then, because we need participants, we're going to open it up to other classes and other students. And we're going to be going into CJ classes and PPE classes and getting other students to participate. So my point being, the longer you wait, the less likely you're going to find a session that works for you. Okay, so if you're thinking about participating, especially now that you got your first exam grade back, all right, that's usually when I see an influx in participation rates in my classes, is right after the first exam. All right, if you're thinking of participating, you may want to log in, look for sessions. Right now, I think there's 1 or 2 sessions available for this week because everything's full. But next week, there's sessions available, and sign up for them sooner rather than later because if you wait to the end of the quarter, you're likely not going to find a session that's going to work for you. Okay? Is that what I wanted to say? Okay, sounds good. All right, so let's move on here. Let's finish up talking about this chapter. And the one thing we're going to avoid right now is the whole last part of the chapter on the ratio rule. We're going to avoid right now. We're going to cover that a lot more when we get to chapter 8, where we say thinking rationally about uncertainty. And in that chapter, we're going to be looking back at more what should we do to address this irrational decision-making that we see is kind of pervasive. Okay? So we'll come back to that in those type of perspectives there. the Bayes theorem and expected utility later in the quarter. Okay? So for today, I just want to finish up talking about here. Let me find where I want to go. On the availability heuristic, understanding what this is, why it occurs, and then moving on to the representativeness heuristic and really understanding the nuances of the two of these. And then bringing it back to what we brought up last class of is it anchoring or is it availability, and trying to understand that distinction there as well. Okay? So we talked last class about the availability heuristic. What is this? And again, don't read the slide. Somebody tell me what the availability heuristic is. From where? From memory, right? Okay. So it's our tendency to estimate the likelihood of something based upon how easily we can retrieve examples from memory. You agree with that? Yeah? And what are the two things that are going to influence that estimate? Well, we'll get to that in a second of what factors will contribute to it. But as far as that retrieval part of it, in estimating, what are the things that we're going to actually pay attention to that are going to lead to that estimate of likelihood? How easy it comes up and how many we can retrieve. And by how easy it comes up, what's the term that we use for that? Fluency. Okay? So that's what we mean. It relies upon the fluency in the amount of items retrieved. Right? Fluency meaning how easy those relevant examples come to mind. Okay? Yes? It could be, because is the strength of the memory going to influence how quickly and easily we are to retrieve it? Well, yeah, but the strength of a memory is going to predict its availability, right? The thing that you know the most or know more is going to be more easily retrieved. Therefore, is that going to affect its fluency or our perception of how easily retrieved it was? Right? So stronger memories, things we're more familiar with, are going to be more fluent. Okay? Which of these is more important? Why?
Because the amount wouldn't really matter if it's not easy to get that amount there. Fluency allows you to pull those examples easily without using cognitive effort.
Okay. So what's the evidence that we have that fluency is more important? Aggressive? Assertive, okay. Not aggressive.
How assertive you are, and then use that to predict how assertive you will be.
Okay. So pull 6 examples versus 12 examples, right? And who do they find would estimate that they would be more assertive in the future? Those that pulled 6 or those that pulled 12? Those that pulled 6, they predicted they would be more assertive in the future than those that pulled 12. So obviously those that pulled 12 pulled more, but it took more effort because it was more difficult to come up with 12 examples than 6. So therefore, they corrected their estimate to sit there and say, it might be less likely. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's basically what we finished up talking about last class, right? We're sitting there and looking at that to sit there and say fluency is more important than number. Okay? But now let's go into talk about what are the cognitive processes of availability and how does this occur. And then we're going to spend some time looking at things that influence various steps of these processes that will then influence how available something is. One of which could be the strength of the memory. Right? Well, let's take a look at some of these things. So the first couple steps of this are acquisition and retention. What do we mean by this? What is acquisition? Gathering of what? Of memories. Okay? So when does acquisition occur? As an experience happens. Is acquisition occurring at the point in which you're making the judgment? Right? So acquisition, does it occur at the point, like say if I say, estimate, let's use one we used last class. What's the probability that the average student, or what's the probability of a student at UW-Tacoma getting a speeding ticket in the last 6 months? Is acquisition occurring right now as you're trying to estimate that probability? No. When did acquisition occur? Exactly, right? So acquisition, what are we acquiring? The knowledge that's what? Relevant to the judgment task, right? And that's knowledge that we acquired throughout our life, at times past. Could have been yesterday if you got a speeding ticket yesterday. Or it could have been 5 months ago if you got a speeding ticket. Or 3 weeks ago when you heard your friends say that they got a speeding ticket on the way to campus, right? Acquisition is the acquiring of relevant information that you experience. And do you know when you're acquiring it that it's going to be relevant to some future judgment? No, that's the point we're trying to make, is the acquisition is completely irrelevant to the judgment task. You're not acquiring it to say, I'm going to be asked a question about this later on. It's just an experience that you have, so it's normal memory processing. And then storage is what? Or, not storage, retention. We say retention or forgetting. What do we mean by this? No, this is what we mean by when you store it in. That's why storage is up there. Like acquiring it and putting it into long-term memory is the first step. But then we talk about retention or forgetting. What do we mean by that? How long it stays in memory. Right? Like Kaylin said. That's the time between when you acquired the information and some potential future judgment task in which that information would be relevant. How long is that retention interval? Depends. Well, okay, so it depends. What can it range from? Right? It can range from almost no delay. If I give you a piece of information and then I ask you to make a judgment, right? Could be no delay, up to years, right? That retention interval is just the period of time between acquiring the information and some potential judgment task in which that information is going to be relevant. And what can occur in that time? We can either retain that information or we can forget it, right? We can either have it available when a judgment task comes up in which it's relevant, or it could have faded away by then, right? It could have gone and not be available. So that's what the second step is. Okay? First step, we acquire information by experiencing life. We don't know at the time whether it's going to be relevant or irrelevant to some future judgment task, but we're just experiencing life and we're developing memories. And then there's some delay from when you experience something to when it might become relevant to a judgment task. And in that delay, we can either retain the information, and if we retain it, it's what? It's stored, it's a memory, it's available for this judgment task, and if we forget it, it's not available. Right? This stuff seems, or potentially it's inaccessible, but we don't want to get into that. Somebody took memory, so, all right? But our point being that the first two steps of the availability heuristic aren't even related to the judgment task at all. They're getting information and retaining that information. And then the third step is what? Producing what? Oh, I don't want to say produce. I don't want to say produce. The third step is you're presented with some sort of judgment task. And then you have to recognize, wait, something I've experienced in the past that's still available to me might help me in this judgment task. Does that make sense? Right? And then this is what begins the use of the availability heuristic. Okay? This is the third step of that process, but it's really the first step of the judgment task. The first two are just memory acquisition and storage, retention of information. Okay? The third step in this is the first step of the judgment task, where I sit there and say, I've been presented something, and I say, wait, this is a judgment task, and I have something that might be relevant that could help in this? Yeah, Ashley. Ooh, but I guess you could say that it's irrational in that regard. But those past assets, it's not that it's relying on past assets, it's relying on present knowledge. Current knowledge. Does that make sense? Right? So if I'm judging the likelihood of somebody getting a ticket, and I'm relying on my current knowledge of how many people have gotten tickets, it may not be irrational in that regard. Right? It's our current knowledge of past events, so I can see how that could be confusing, right? But it's my present understanding. That is what I'm relying on. Okay? So, I need to recognize that, hey, this is a judgment task, and I might have some information. All right? And that's the first step. And then that's what gets us to the diagram that's in the book. Okay? Where they've diagrammed what are the steps of this availability heuristic. That in step 1 here, which is actually, I'm going to put up here, step 3, I'm given the question, and I recognize that that question is relevant to this judgment task. And then I begin this process, with the first step being probing memory. What do we mean by this? What's a memory probe? Searching for memory? Are we just searching for a memory? A specific memory? And what's specific about that memory? How it applies to the judgment. What did you say, Crystal? How it relates. We're looking for information. We start probing our memory for information that might relate to the task at hand. Right? So if the question is, what's the likelihood of a UW-T student getting a speeding ticket in the last 6 months? What type of information are you going to probe memory for? How many tickets I've had? Because why? Why is that relevant? Possibly, but why is it specifically relevant and how many tickets you have? Because that's knowledge that you have and because you're part of the sample. You're a UW-T student, right? Does that make sense? So it's relevant to you, right? So that would be relevant information. How much do I have? How much have I received? Right? I'm a UW-T student. So what have I received? What other type of things will you probe memory for? Your friends that are UW-T students that have told you about speeding tickets that they've gotten. Is that relevant to the task at hand? Okay. Anything else that you're going to probe memory for? Okay, right? So I might sit there and probe, say, well, I don't know any UW-T students that have gotten tickets, but I know a lot of people age 20 to 25 that have gotten tickets, and that's similar to UW-T, so I might use that as a sample, right? Would that make sense? Right? You're just going to probe your memory for things that are relevant. What type of things aren't going to come up? Yeah, exactly. Right? What you ate for dinner last night, is that relevant? You're going to search your memory for that? No? Unless you have like some attention deficit issue, right? Where, you know, you're like a dog where you're sitting there saying, how many people have squirrel? Right? Okay. You know, something like that, right? But we're not going to probe for what we ate for dinner last night. We're not going to probe for how many people, yeah, you might not probe for how many people got parking tickets, right? Because that's irrelevant, right? But this first step here is basically just queuing memory for information that's relevant. Searching memory and say, how many people do I know that have gotten tickets? How many tickets have I gotten? Right? How often do I see cops on the road? Which I got to tell you, I don't like driving in at 7 o'clock in the morning from Seattle. It's so much better at 5 a.m., which might explain why I haven't had a speeding ticket in 15 years. Last time I got a speeding ticket, I was in college. Huh? No, I didn't. Part of the reason I don't have a speeding ticket is because I got something in here. Okay. Huh? But I haven't been pulled over in probably 10 years. Okay? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. That's irrational, right? These are rational people, right? This is what you need. You need one of these things. These work great. This is a get out of jail free card. Yes. This is a New York City PBA card. PBA is Police Benevolent Association. This basically means that you know a cop and their badge number is on the card and their signature is on the card. And it's amazing that New York City Police is so well respected that it'll get you out of tickets on the West Coast. It'll get you out of tickets. The only place that hasn't gotten me out of a ticket, ironically, is New York State. That was a state trooper, and state troopers don't like city cops. But anyway, okay? My point being, you're going to search for information that's relevant to your task at hand. Okay? That's the first step. Probe memory for things that are relevant. So I'm going to probe for how many tickets have I gotten? How many tickets have other UWT students gotten? How many tickets have other people who are in this age bracket received? Right? I might sit there and say, how many parking tickets have people gotten? I might sit there and say, how many times do I see cops on the side of the road just pulling somebody over in the morning? Right? This morning I saw 3 pulling people over on the side of the highway. I don't know if they were UWT students, but at least I'm getting an idea of how frequently I see somebody getting a ticket on the highway in the morning, right? And I start retrieving for that, okay? I start probing it. And then I probe, say, hey, do I have any of these in my memory? Do I have any information? So I start probing, and then if I hit on something, what do? I retrieve it, okay? And that's the next step. I cue it. And those that took cognitive with me or memory with me will remember this. Those that haven't, this is a good analogy to think of. Probing it is like dropping a rock in a pond. You drop something in a pond, that's the probe. The rock getting dropped in is the probe. But what happens when you drop a rock in the pond? It starts to make ripples. And those ripples do what? They expand from the point of where the rock hit the water, right? Okay? Probing memory is like dropping the rock in. The memory probe is the rock. The activation is like those spreading ripples from that throughout your memory. And if you have a memory that's strong enough, when that activation starts to spread, it's going to trigger that memory. It's going to activate that memory that's associated with that cue, that rock. And then when I activate that memory, what does that do cognitively? It retrieves it. It brings it where? In your working memory into conscious awareness. Right? So that now I actually retrieve it and I'm aware of it. Okay? So now I retrieve that relevant information. Okay? So I sit there and I say, boom, have I gotten any tickets in the last 6 months? And I try to retrieve a memory of that. And say I do retrieve a memory of that. Or I retrieve a memory of not getting a ticket. Or I try to say, okay, how many people do I know that have gotten tickets? That's like a different rock dropping in a slightly different area in memory. Right? And I see, does that activate a memory of, yeah, Jim, Tom, and Bob all got tickets in the last 6 months. Or no, I can't remember any examples of anybody else getting a ticket. And so I keep dropping all these rocks in memory of different probes. Other people who aren't UWT students getting tickets. Parking tickets versus speeding tickets. How many cops have I seen on the highway? These are all different probes that are dropping in that I'm trying to retrieve specific instances of that match that probe. And when I do retrieve an instance, then what's the next step of that? I assess what? How easily it was for me to retrieve that instance. Not yet. Okay? We'll get that in a second. Okay? You see this loop here? Okay? Basically what this loop is saying is that I'm going to retrieve an instance. I'm going to assess how easily it was to retrieve that instance. And then I'm going to see, did I retrieve another instance? And I'm going to assess, right, how easy it was to retrieve that, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of that loop, when I say, nope, there's no more to retrieve, that's when I'm going to say, okay, how many do I have and how easy were they to retrieve? Does that make sense? Okay. But I do this on a step-by-step of, okay, how many tickets do I have? That's the first cue that I drop in. 0. Okay. How many tickets do my friends have? And I might remember 3 different experiences at that point in time. right? I remember Bob got one. I remember Jim got one. I remember Tom got one. I assess how easy was it for me to retrieve each of those recollections, right? So that's why we have this continual loop here until I get to the point of, nope, there's no more items that I can retrieve. And then I'm sitting there saying, okay, overall, I do that last step here of producing the estimate, all right? Which is, okay, how easy did I retrieve these and how many did I retrieve? And if I retrieved a lot and it was really easy to retrieve, what is going to be my estimate of a probability? It's going to be a rather high probability, right? If I couldn't think of a single example, what is going to be my estimate? A low probability, right? Can this explain why people will vary a lot in their probability estimates? Why? Right? Because this is really based upon each person's individual memory. Right? And say you are the type of person to speed a lot. Is your estimate going to be higher? Why? And so according to the availability heuristic, my estimate's going to be higher because why? Because I have more instances that are retrieved that were easily retrievable. Right? If you hang out with a lot of, say you don't have a lot of speeding tickets, but say that you drive a GT Mustang, or I was going to sit there and say you drive like a Subaru WRX or like one of those late 90s, early 2000s Acura Integra, and you got a little clip hanging off the back of your bumper, right? You don't have a lot of tickets, but it suggests you hang out with a lot of people that what? Race, so you might have a lot of tickets yourself. You guys know that? You ever pull up behind a car and you see a little clip hanging down underneath the back bumper? You know what that means? That they race. It's a little cue for you. So you know if you ever want to get into a street race. No cops know that. They're not stupid. Well, they might make poor decisions, but they're not that dumb. I know, those comments. There's probably one person that thinks they're fake fooling the cops, but okay. But, so I might sit there and I might not have a lot of instances myself, but I might hang out with a lot of people who have gotten a lot of speeding tickets, so that might bias me. Whereas, maybe you drive a minivan, like an old 80s Dodge Caravan, like one of the boxy ones, that no matter what you do, you can't get the thing above 55 miles per hour. Right? Your estimate of the likelihood of people getting speeding tickets is going to be what? Lower, because you're going to be less likely to pull relevant examples just because no matter how much you might want to speed, your vehicle just won't do it. Second you get up to 50, the wheels start going. Yeah, those are good cars to have, right? All right, but that's the process of the availability heuristic. Now, this is a good point to bring up what you brought up last class. Let's look at the nuance here. Say I got a lot of speeding tickets. Okay? Is that anchoring or is it availability? Is it? He said if you're looking at yours, it's anchoring. What do you mean by that? Okay, so if it could be that, right? It could be if I'm perceiving myself as an anchor and then I'm adjusting based upon what other people think or what I think about other people, then it would be anchor and adjustment. But could it also be availability? Yeah, Sam.
Egocentric bias is just kind of like the most basic form of availability. Like you have to think of something and you think of yourself as a person in the whole.
Okay.
So maybe it's kind of both.
So it could be both, right? It could be both things, that the first step of anchor and adjustment is really an availability process because would that make sense from a memory perspective? Is it that we're egocentric and that it's a personality characteristic, or could it just be a memory bias that we tend to think of ourselves first? Some are not in your head that it could be that. Well, then what do we mean by that? How could it be a memory bias that we think of ourselves first? Because we have the most available memories about what? About ourselves. We know ourselves the best, right? So those that have taken cognitive know, what's the single best way to learn something? Yep. Okay, deeper processing, and the deepest type of processing is what? It's something called the self-reference effect. If you connect it with yourself, you're more likely to know it because we know ourselves the best. We think about things that happen to ourselves more, which means knowing ourselves the best, thinking about it more, makes it more likely to be deeper encoded, which means it's going to be more available at this point in time. So maybe that egocentric bias isn't a personality trait of which we're egotistical in that negative sense. We're not narcissistic. Rather, it's just a normal bias of memory of those are the strongest memories. And so an anchor and adjustment, we anchor on ourselves because that's the first anchor that comes to mind. It could be that, right? These can work together. That's the point that we're trying to make here. Now, we might be able to parse it out a little bit more by asking somebody their decision strategy to know, is it anchor and adjustment or is it just availability, right? If they just sit there and they say, oh, well, you know, I can think of 3 instances myself, so that must mean a lot of people get them. That's availability. If I sit there and I say, well, I've gotten about 5 in the last few months, but I know I drive faster than other people, so I'm going to guess that other people may have only gotten 1, maybe none. Exactly, right? So it might be how you frame it, but it's not necessarily how you frame it. It's the process that we see evidence of people going through, right? If I'm just sitting there saying, I can easily think of 5 instances, yeah, people get a lot of speeding tickets. That's availability because they're saying it's on ease of just thinking of the instances. If I say, well, I've gotten so many, but I know that I drive faster or slower than most people, so I'm going to sit there and think they're probably going to be more or less than me. That's evidence then of anchor and adjustment. But we're going to see this throughout, and that's one of the important things I want you to get, is even though we talk about these as independent heuristics, they all rely on memory to some point. So therefore, there's going to be some overlap here. And therefore, it's not to say that they're mutually exclusive. In some instances, it's going to be obvious that it's one of these heuristics. In other instances, it may not be obvious. Is it anchoring? Is it adjustment? Is it is it availability? Is it representativeness? And so on, because it's just there's going to be variability here, because they all rely on the same basic premise, which is our memory system. All right? Does this make sense? These processes? Questions on what the process is? No? All right. So we want to switch now. We want to look and sit there and say, okay, now that we understand what are the cognitive processes of this approach, now we want to look and see, well, where can bias start to come into play in these steps? Right? Because this whole approach, the availability heuristic, says that we do what? We estimate the likelihood of an event based upon what? Our memories, but not just our memories, but the availability of the memories, relevant to the decision, and I've heard something that's most specific about it. Not just, somebody's saying it, Allison's saying it. Say it louder. How easily we retrieve those relevant memories. Okay? The fluency of recall. Exactly, okay? So that's the important thing. The availability heuristic says that we will estimate the likelihood of something based upon how easily we can retrieve relevant examples. All right? So, with that, bias can come into play. Right? And we want to talk about, well, where can this bias come from? One of the important things where this bias can come from is what? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but saying if my estimate is based upon my memory and how easily I can retrieve items, then we could see bias can come from, okay, so it can come from what we're actually putting in the memory to begin with. What we're exposed to, right? So one of the things that I like to say, anybody who's taken methods yet, you may be familiar with this phrase, and anybody who's going to graduate school or who's going to be taking methods now, one of the most important phrases that I can say with any research is garbage in, garbage out. Okay? What does that mean? That's part of it in this context that we're going to get to, right? If I put garbage in, it's not going to be available to get out. But from a research standpoint, what do we mean by garbage in, garbage out? Exactly. If you're doing shit research, you're going to get shit results. That's the importance of knowing the scientific method. If you're not doing the method proper, who cares? There's no point in doing it because you're not going to get anything useful out of the back end. Okay? That's what we mean by garbage in, garbage out. So you got to make sure you're doing the process well to start with, or else you're not going to get, there's no point in doing it at all. Right? Like, there's another analogy that I can't remember what it is, right? Well, no, there's no such thing as stupid questions. They're just stupid people, right? Okay? Right? No, I'm trying to think of a more colloquial example of it, right? I mean, I guess it's like putting lipstick on a pig, right? I mean, what you start with is what you start with. You can only do so much with it. Does that make sense? So let's take that analogy and bring that over to memory, right? If I'm trying to rely on what I can retrieve from memory, and I'm making an assessment of its likelihood based upon what I can retrieve from memory, one of the factors that might influence what I retrieve from memory is what? The encoding, what I'm actually getting exposed to begin with. Right? So that's the first step of where memory bias can come from here, is what information are we actually getting in the memory to begin with? At step one, which isn't even part of the judgment task yet, right? We said the judgment task didn't begin until what step? 3, right? So we're talking here about, we might be biased on the availability heuristic might be damned before the judgment task even comes up. Right? Because it's based upon what we have in our memory system, and that can be biased there as well, right? Because it says, basically, what we encounter more often is more likely to be stored in our memory system, right? And what we encounter more often, the more examples that are stored in our memory system, the more what? The more that we're going to have available to retrieve, which means, then what? The more examples that are stored in a memory system, the more likely we are to do what? Exactly. Make the estimate to be higher. Right? So the first form of bias can be just what's getting into our memory system. Okay? But the problem here is that what we're exposed to isn't necessarily representative of the true state of the world. Does that make sense? And what are some examples of that? Media bias, right? That's a big example of it. Fox News. Or you can go the other side for what's the CNN, right? I mean, you ever watch like the same event on both of those channels? Right? And see how they portray the same information, but it's a framing issue, which we're going to get to later in the quarter. We'll talk about framing and decision making later in the quarter, okay? But the point here is media bias, what we're exposed to. All right? And what's one of the best examples of media bias that we see? Which I believe we have coming up on the next slide here. Politics is an example of media bias, right? But I don't want to sit there because I don't want to get us too confused. We're talking here about bias in the representation of what? The actual state of the world, but I don't want to view it as a bias in an interpretation of an event. We're talking here for the availability heuristic that it's bias in what? Well, yeah, but that's a little bit too vague. Let's go back. The availability heuristic says that we estimate the likelihood of an event based upon what? The fluency that we can recall what? examples of the event. Okay? So let's be specific to the availability heuristic. When we say bias in getting information in, if we say that it's not reflective of the true state of the world, what is that suggesting? That we're being exposed to what? Examples that aren't what? That are disproportionate to what? The true state of the world. So that's what we want to focus on here. We don't want to focus on interpretation in that Fox News is presenting it one way and CNN's presenting it another way. We're talking about the number of examples of something that we're getting exposed to. Not the interpretation of those examples. That's a different thing. We'll get to that in explanation-based judgments and framing effects later. Right now we're talking about for the availability heuristic, it's bias in the presentation of examples. Okay? Does that make sense? So give me an example of something in which there might be biased presentation in the examples. Yeah. So we might see that more in the news media of over-reporting certain types of events, disproportionate to how they actually are in the real world, right? So talking more about the race of the defendant in certain cases, so therefore now we're exposed to race and this being linked together, and that's all we're exposed to? Yeah. Crime rate in general, right? What do we see on the news? Crimes, 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 crimes. Right? That's what we get exposed to on the news. Right? What don't we get exposed to on the news? No crime occurred. No crime occurred. No crime occurred. Right? So we always see, we can more easily bring to mind examples of crime than non-crime because that's what we get exposed to on the news. Right? Does that make sense? That could be an example of media bias here. It's not in the interpretation of the event. Rather, it's we see certain types of events disproportionate to their true rate in the population. Okay? And that's what we mean by media bias. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then we'll talk a little bit later on about regressive estimates and inductive and deductive reasoning. But first here, with media bias. We see media bias in the news. Right? And they use a phrase in the chapter which is used pervasively throughout communications, right? Is that, what am I going to put on the front cover of a newspaper? Or what am I going to lead a newscast with? Breaking news, something that's sensational, right? And there's a phrase that's used that rhymes to describe it. What is that? If it bleeds, it leads, right? What do we mean by that? The more shocking it is, we want to put it out there, right? Now, what is it, though, about shocking things? Things are shocking because why? Because they're unusual. But the shocking things are the things we want to put on the news, right? We want to know the story of the elderly woman that got hit by the car crossing the street. We don't want to know all the times and put it on the news of the elderly woman that crossed the street with no problem. Right? So, the shocking, unusual things are the things that we're going to see more examples of. Could that potentially bias our memory? Right? Because now, when it comes to availability, what happens? The things I'm going to be more likely to retrieve examples of are the things that are what? Less likely to happen. Right? That's the first example of it there. We're going to get to that in a few minutes here, looking at just our natural bias to perceive the world that way, not even through media. Okay? But yeah, you're exactly right on with that, okay? So, we see that there. The news agencies acknowledge the fact that they're showing us disproportionate rates of things. Right? But we're not usually sensitive to that when we're making these availability assessments. The other thing we see is in reality TV. And here's some information for you on this, which the book talks about this a little bit. But one of the big areas that we see this in are TV shows like Cops. And what do we find with Cops? When we look at the TV show Cops, and this is a perfect example of what it is, you get the film crew there. Who's the cop? A white male. Who's a suspect? Young black males. Right? And although the producer of Cops sits there and says, we don't do anything, we actually go out of our way to try to present more white suspects than black suspects because we want to avoid this. Researchers have actually gone through and done content analysis of Cops programs at various points in time. You can see that early 90s and the late 2000s, they did these. And what they found was that white police officers and non-white male suspects are overrepresented compared to their true rate in both populations. Now, one thing that's been done here is if you've seen like they now have Cops Reloaded or something like that. Have you seen those shows where they say, we're now taking the best footage that we have and we're redoing it? Part of the reason that they've done that is to try to address this bias. Right? So they're not just doing reruns of Cops, but they sat there and they said, we want to get a better balance here. So they've recast, they've taken individual clips and they put them together in a new package to try to avoid this bias. All right? But the data that was done has demonstrated this, right? They found that in one set of the 2007 study, they found that in one grouping of episodes that they sampled, randomly sampled episodes, 92% of the police officers were white males. 92% were white male police officers. There was one female police officer in the entire thing. Right? So 92% of the police officers were white males. And the non-white male suspects constituted over 65% of the suspects in those episodes. So that doesn't include female suspects, right? Well, that's not just white, non-white. That's non-white male suspects were 65%. So there was also some non-white female suspects and so on. And they actually look at the data some more of this and they identify what they're being presented as. The white males in Cops, when they're presented on Cops, are typically presented in domestic disturbance situations. The white male suspects are domestic disturbance situations. The black male suspects, more violent crimes. And we can actually see, looking at all reality TV, not just Cops, you find that violent crimes are overrepresented in reality television than nonviolent crimes. Even though violent crimes are an thankfully, extremely small percentage of crime, which is a good thing. But this gets back to what Stephen was sitting there saying, is our estimates of the crime rate is typically much higher than what reality is. And why is that? Because we see crime a lot, and we think of this. Do you guys have in your neighborhood like local news blogs? I don't know if that makes any sense. Seattle neighborhoods, like every neighborhood in Seattle has this blog, which isn't just like a blog. It's actually like journalists that run it. Does that make sense? Right? So it's not like Bob down the street has a blog, okay? Right? It's actually a news organization, but it's neighborhood specific. Okay? If you ever looked, the one because I live in West Seattle, there's something called the West Seattle blog, where it's just basically all news that's relevant to West Seattle. But everybody can post comments on every news story, and because it's close to home, people what? They care more. So they're going to post more post more comments. And I always hate reading it where they post something about crime and people, crime is up, crime rates, we need to do something in Seattle, this is getting so ridiculous. And I always want to post in and say, look at the facts, you ignorant. You know, crime rate isn't up. Crime rate has dropped precipitously since the early 80s. It's a steady drop since the early 80s. And the rate of violent crime has decreased faster than the rate of nonviolent crime. We are safer today than we ever have been in the United States as far as crime per resident. Does that make sense? You know, per capita crime rate. We are safer. What's that? We're going to see that, and that's one of the things that they argue here with representativeness later in the chapter, right? Then they argue one of the last things that you may have missed at the end of the chapter when they talk about representativeness heuristic is that it's so pervasive, but it's so important because representativeness becomes the basis for policy decisions and what we're going to target at that one point in time, right? I mean, we're just going to sit there and what's the big target now? Availability and representativeness are coming into play. What triggered the gun debate that we're having nationwide right now? Sandy Hook, right? Did that not? I mean, and we're talking that triggered it. There was always discussion. After Virginia Tech, there was discussion over gun control, right? And there's always been discussion after all of these school shootings, right? But then Sandy Hook happened, and all of a sudden it was little kids, not teenagers or college students that are getting shot. And boy, that one event changed the whole national landscape. Availability. Bremerton, the little kid. Yeah, the little kid here in Bremerton that brought a gun into school, right? And shot that little girl, right? So we see that there. That changed everything, right? As far as the national landscape, but that's availability, right? They demonstrated, what was travel like in the 6 months after 9/11? Scarce, right? People just didn't want to get on airplanes, right? They didn't want to get on airplanes because it was available. The likelihood of dying in an airplane was so fresh in our minds that we perceived that as a greater likelihood and said, I ain't flying, screw that. I'll drive 10 hours, right? Those type of things there. We also see in other areas, though, and I want to move on to make sure we have time to get through representativeness, okay? Regressive estimates. What do we mean by this? We talked about this last class. So we can kind of...
When it's rare, we tend to overestimate it, and when it's common, we tend to underestimate it.
Exactly, right? Remember from like the slide that we had of death rate versus perceived death rate? Okay? And we found that when it's rare, we tend to overestimate it. Well, according to the availability heuristic, it would say that what? We're overestimating it because even though it's rare, what? We have more instances available in our memory, right? So why would we have more instances available in our memory of rare events? That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Because it stands out more. It's more novel. And what happens when things are novel or unusual? But why do we remember it more? What's the connection? It's novel and unusual, and then why do we remember it more? And so therefore what? It's more easily accessible, but again, why? I'm looking at the people who have taken memory and cognition because I want you to... Because there's deeper encoding of it. Why? Because we pay more attention to it. We process it more deeply. Right? That's basically what we're getting at here. It's a normal cognitive bias that we notice unusual things. And when we notice the unusual thing, it's a normal cognitive bias to focus attention on it. And if we focus attention on something, what are we likely to do with that? We're going to be more likely to learn it more, right? And remember it later on. Plus, if we see something unusual, what's another normal cognitive bias that we do about it? Investigate it. We ask what question? Why? With that annoying 3-year-old kid. Right? Why? 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 Right? You see something weird, you're like, son of a bitch, why did that happen? And if I'm sitting there and now I'm saying, why did that happen? Damn, that's weird. What am I doing? Okay, which is resulting in what? Deeper encoding, which means that now, later on, when I'm asked to render an availability assessment or a judgment of the likelihood, that instance is what? It comes to mind faster than what? The other common examples in which you're like, yeah, that happens all the time, I'm not even going to pay attention to it. Does that make sense? Right? Driving in the road, how many cars, here's a good example of it. 2 days ago, before I drove in here, I didn't pay any attention to how many cars I saw on the highway and how many were not getting speeding tickets. But I just told you today, how many did I see getting tickets this morning? 3. I noticed the unusual event, and I said, oh, wow, there's another speeding ticket, another cop there. Maybe I need to alter my speed to make sure I don't get one, right? But the common events, you just don't even think about. So if I don't think about it, it's not there to retrieve when I'm making this availability assessment. Does that make sense? Right? So it's a normal cognitive bias. It's not necessarily media bias. It can be. But we also do it in our daily life too, outside of the media. So it's not just those bastards in the media that are warping our fragile little minds. You're warping your own fragile little mind. Yeah. Yeah, that's part of it too. And that's going to be one of those things of just, and usually you notice it after you buy it, and you're just like, son of a bitch, why did I buy it in green? Everybody has a green car. Right? That's why you go test drive, you make your decision, and then you wait a few days and drive around to make sure that you're happy with the decision. Salesmen don't want you to do that. Okay? All right? This gives you that perception of those things being more more common than they actually are, because you're focusing on them more. They're more available. So you overestimate their frequency. And the last thing here that we're going to talk about is this inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning contrasts with what other type of reasoning? Deductive. Inductive means that we do what? Exactly. Inductive reasoning is I have a couple instances and I generalize to the whole based upon those couple instances. Deductive is what? Exactly. Deductive is I have information about the whole, so therefore I make an assessment of a member of that whole based upon my knowledge of the whole. Okay? Which one is the better decision making? Deductive is more appropriate. You're judging about an individual based upon the population rather than judging a population based upon an individual. Does that make sense? Inductive reasoning is really the basis for what? Something that we use every single day. Well, stereotypes. It's the basis. We develop stereotypes inductively. We meet somebody that's of a certain group that we don't really know a lot of people of, and we make a stereotype, or we make an assessment of that person, whether it's good or bad. Wow, they're a really nice guy. Wow, they're a really nice guy. I've never met any Greeks before, but he's a really nice guy. And then you go and you meet another Greek. Say, wow, he's a really nice guy too. Wow, Greeks are really nice people. Right? That's inductive reasoning. Uh-huh. Yeah. You make an assessment of the whole that, wow, those guys are really attractive, right? But you make an assessment of the whole based upon specific instances. That's stereotype formation. That's what we do, right? But then, once we have the stereotype, what do we do?
Ignore when people break the stereotype.
Well, that's completely different. I want to get off the topic there, right? But related to inductive and deductive reasoning. Okay? What do we do when we have the stereotype and we encounter a new member of the group? We engage in what type of reasoning at that point in time? Well, no, we meet a new person, and what do? We engage in deductive reasoning, because now we have this knowledge of the group, and so we make an assessment of that person based upon that knowledge, right? I meet a few Greek guys, they're all nice. Oh, Greeks are nice people. I meet a fourth Greek person, and before I even meet him, I'm like, he's going to be nice. Right? That's deductive reasoning, okay? Well, that is what we can see here and what's stored in memory. Okay? This can affect us. All right? We see this few examples and we conclude they all must be like that. We see a few examples of speeding tickets. So we say, wow, I've seen a few examples of college kids getting speeding tickets. Most college kids are going to be like that. Right? That inductive reasoning leads to this. And this is all bias on what we're actually getting into memory here. Okay? Let's take a break here and come back. And then we're going to move through this last part here on availability kind of quickly here. And then I want to make sure we get to representativeness too. All right, so let's take a few-minute break and we'll come back and we'll do this activity here. No. I'm going to have to change my stereotype now. Hennigan isn't Greek.
It's Irish.
As not. Gotta make the judgment quickly. Let's come up with some number. Write it down. All right, everybody got a number written down? Okay, both groups, open your eyes. All right, first group. Start to give me some numbers. 5-letter words that begin with S. Give me your estimates. 3,000? 7,500. Anybody else? 1,200? Anybody else? 1,500? 600? Anybody else? 682. I love when it's so specific. He's the guy on Price is Right that has no freaking clue, but he's not going to put it like at 1,000. He's going to be like $947. Right? Okay. Right? Anybody else want to provide an estimate on your side? Sean, did you put how much? 3,500? Okay. That's why I'm clarifying. Over here, what's your estimates? 90, 110, 7,000, 900, 2,000, Jessica? 1,500, 1,800? Really? I thought you just gave me 7,000. Did you just change? Oh, you said 10K. Okay. All right. So let's just do an estimate over here. This is a small sample size, so we might be skewed here, okay? Let's just take out the most extreme on both sides, okay? If we take out the most extreme on both sides, which side averaged higher? This side, right? Would we say that this side over here had the higher average than the other side? Okay. But you want to know what reality is? It's the other way around. To the point of, now granted, I can't be precise because I didn't go through Webster, okay? But I did go through Scrabble, okay? And over here, over on this side, basically what we tend to find let me get up here, we have somewhere in the ballpark of 1,047 words. Over here, there's like 2,179. So over double the amount of 5-letter words that have S in the 5th position compared to 5-letter words that begin with S. So my question for you then, why did this group provide such a greater estimate than this group? Is that the reason? Just easier to recall? Is this an example of the availability heuristic? Right? Because what did you do when you're trying to estimate it? You're trying to think of what? Words that begin with S or 5-letter words that end with S? Right? And that's basically what we find. We find people tend to provide the larger estimates for the first list rather than the latter, which is what you guys demonstrated here. It's because it's so much more difficult to think of 5-letter words that end with S than 5-letter words that begin with S. What is this demonstrating then? That another reason or another biasing factor in the availability heuristic isn't the words in memory, it's what? The ease of retrieving that information, right? It's a bias in how we retrieve information too. Because if I showed you those words, the 2,000 plus words that end with S, that are 5 letters long, and the 1,000 plus that begin with S, odds are you're going to be able to recognize and know what each of those words is, or at least the same percentage of both. Does that make sense? It's not like words that end with S you're less familiar with. You know those words. You just have more difficulty retrieving them. Right? Because the cue wasn't that good. And this is the importance of fluency. Okay? It isn't just having the information in memory and a bias in that information, like what we just talked about. If we have a biased representation in memory, of course, we're now going to have a bias in the availability heuristic. But we might not have a bias in representation in memory, but there might be a bias in retrieving things retrieving certain types of information. And that's what we're getting at here. Memories that are more salient are more likely to be retrieved. What do we mean by salient? Could kind of be dominant, but it's a little bit more nuanced than dominant. It could be relevance or it could be importance. I'm sorry? More stable, more constant, more relevant. You're on the right track, but salient isn't, all of these things are going to relate to a memory being salient or not. But a salient memory is one that is what? It's like a salient thing is something that's right at the cusp of, it's something that's like sitting right below conscious awareness. Okay? It's something that's more easily retrievable. Something that's salient is something that we're aware of. So memories that are more likely to be aware of are those that are going to be more likely to be retrieved. Does that make sense? Okay? Good example of this. Here's an example of a salient memory, okay? Staying on the same theme of a speeding ticket. I'm assuming, just think about the time that you've gotten a speeding ticket, or maybe you've gotten pulled over but you didn't get a speeding ticket, right? That memory is more salient now, right? So what typically happens? The remainder of that day, what are you doing? Watching your speed, and you're staying like right at the speed limit, right? And the next day, you're still staying right at the speed limit, right? But over time, what happens? The memory of that speeding ticket isn't as salient, so therefore, you start to get back to old habits gradually, right? That's what we mean by salient. Salient is something that's readily, easily available. Okay? And there's a variety of factors that will influence how available a memory is. The first is recency. What do we mean by this? We don't have to spend a lot of time on this. Most recent events are what? They're more easily retrievable, right? The example we just gave. The day you get a speeding ticket, you're more likely to think about that speeding ticket than 2 months later, right? What you ate for breakfast today is more easily retrievable than what you ate for breakfast last week. Does that make sense? Right? That's what we mean. Recency, okay? More recent events are more easily retrieved. Other things that affect it, distinctiveness. What do we mean by this? What's the uniqueness of what? The event of the memory, right? So what do we think, what role does that play? If it's more distinctive, it's what? More salient. It's more likely to be retrieved. Vivid or unusual events are more strongly encoded. Therefore, they're more likely to be retrieved. And in the book, they talk about the Reyes et al. Drunk driving case, right? And what do they manipulate in that case? This was the case, to give you a cue, of the defendant allegedly crashed his car into the back of a parked garbage truck while intoxicated. And they manipulated two things to demonstrate that that would have an effect on the availability of the information. One was the testimony of the owner of the garbage truck company, and the other was a testimony of somebody else who testified what happened with the person before they left the house and started driving, right? And the owner of the the garbage truck company got up there one time, and for one group, he testified that what? The truck was gray. And they made it more salient because it was more distinctive, because he didn't just sit there and say the truck was gray, but he sat there and said, yeah, my truck is gray, but who cares about that? What do you want me to do? You want me to paint them pink? Right? That's a more vivid, unusual response. It's more memorable. Or the story of the other side was that the defendant, when he left the house, had, spilled something all over the floor, right? Or did he vomit all over the floor? Guacamole. He spilled a big bowl of guacamole all over the white shag carpet, because people have white shag carpet, right? I mean, granted, should point out this was late 70s, so people did have white shag carpet at that time, okay? Right? But that's more vivid, right? And they found that the side that presented the more vivid testimony was what? More distinctive, was more easily retrieved. Right? And then therefore had more of an effect on the judgment that they passed. Okay? Personal importance, this one we already talked about. Events that are personally significant are more salient. Things that happen to me, I'm more likely to retrieve than things that happen to somebody else. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about here quickly is mood congruence. What do we mean by this? Exactly. So if I'm in a happy mood right now, what am I likely to retrieve? Happy things. Right? If I'm in a bad mood right now, what am I likely to retrieve? Bad memories. Right? That's why nobody wants to be around a miserable person. Right? Because all they want to do is think about bad things. And you don't want to think about bad things because we're typically happy, so we want to think about what? Happy things. Right? That's why in social psych, the statement misery loves company is only true if that company is what? Also miserable. Right? It isn't that misery loves company, it's that misery loves miserable company. And that's what they want. Okay? But we recall information consistent with our current mood. So these are all factors that influence a bias in getting memories out as well. So this will affect our judgment that we make. If I'm asked to make an assessment of the divorce rate when I'm in a good mood, I might say it's lower than if I'm asked to make an assessment of the divorce rate if I'm in a bad mood. Does that make sense? And that's because of the availability of information. I'm less likely to retrieve negative instances when I'm in a good mood. So I'm going to assess divorce to be less likely. Here's a good one. I like this one. You guys remember this? Yeah? Now, looking at your responses, it's clear that some of you did not understand what this was. Right? Because you sat there and you said, how many lines are passing through? Well, they're the same. There's one line going through each. That's not understanding the question. Okay? What this is saying is that a path is a line that connects an X in the top row of one structure with an X in the bottom row of another. Okay? Passing through only one. So let me show you. Here, this would be one path. This would be another path. This would be another path. Does that make sense? That's what we mean by it. Okay? Here, this could be one path. Right? This is another path. Does that make sense? All right. So if that makes more sense, now you see it. The question is now asking, all right, how many paths are there in structure A and structure B? We just said there's not one. How many paths are possible through structure A? That's why I'm saying some didn't understand the question. Okay? How many paths are possible through structure A? How many paths? But that's what it says. How many paths are there? A path is a line that can connect. In other words,
Yeah, but you had an example for it, so you're looking at it. When you asked it originally, you didn't say how many are possible.
well, but that's why I'm saying the question wasn't clear. People didn't understand it, okay? But still, looking at that, I excluded those people that had like the really low numbers from the analysis here, okay? Like the 1 and 1. Because obviously it was obvious to me that you didn't understand the question, so I excluded those because we don't want to have, that's that garbage in, garbage out, not to say that you're garbage, okay? But if you have data that's coming in that isn't assessing what you're trying to assess, you try to remove that data, okay? So we removed this. But for the remaining people that showed evidence of understanding it because they provide different estimates across each one, or at least larger estimates, even if they were the same, what do you think was the average? Or which side do you think has more paths? Structure A? Structure B? Or some of you think both? Okay? The correct answer on both, you guys know what it is? Some of you obviously know, so I had to exclude you as well because you knew that this was just a simple math problem. And so if it's a simple math problem, it is no longer a judgment. So this isn't demonstrating a judgment, but the correct response is that there's 512 in both of them. Exactly the same. 2 to the 8th or 8 to the 3rd? Yep. Okay, so if you knew that, you got it right. But what did we find in your responses? Excluding those that had the correct response and excluding those that said 1 and 1, okay? This was the average that we got, that people perceive structure A to have more paths through it, more possible paths, than structure B. Why? Because it's easier to what? It's easier to imagine a path through structure A than structure B. And that's the third thing that we want to talk about here, is bias in imagining events. When we say fluency, we can also see evidence of fluency in our ability to imagine an event occurring will also influence our estimate of its likelihood. So it isn't just retrieving examples of the event, but now it's okay, I don't have any examples, but how easily can I imagine that event having occurred? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the third thing here. How easily we can imagine an event will affect our estimates of its likelihood. And if we successfully imagine the event, we think it's more likely. But if we try to imagine an event and we say, no, it's not possible, it's going to be viewed to be less likely. Does that make sense? Okay.
That was the falling in the shower and the airplane part by death example, right? It's easier for us to imagine falling in the shower and dying than getting hit by an airplane part and dying.
Well, actually, it's easier for us to imagine falling in a shower and not dying than it is to imagine getting hit by something falling out of the sky and dying. So therefore, I'm going to estimate the likelihood of dying from getting hit by an airplane part to be greater than falling in a shower because I can more easily imagine that occurring. Does that make sense? Okay. So now it's not, I don't know any instances of somebody dying from getting hit by airplane debris. Do I? I can think of one instance. Yeah, I know, Breaking Bad, right? That wasn't the one that I was thinking of, but that's a good one, right? I can think of one instance that happened in New York right after 9/11. People don't remember this, but 2 months after 9/11, another jetliner blew up in the sky over Queens. Took off from JFK and blew up in the sky. And the plane dropped on a neighborhood in Queens. Right? So some people on the ground died in their houses from a jet engine landing on the house. And everybody, of course, immediately is terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. Donnie Darko's another example, right? But it wasn't terrorism. It was, defective plane. They did the analysis, and there was something, I don't remember what was wrong with the plane now, right? But I can think of one example, real world, not Breaking Bad or Donnie Darko, okay, of somebody dying from airplane debris. But most of us can't think of an example. But we can imagine, okay, I can picture somebody getting killed from a jet engine falling out of the sky. So I might perceive it to be more likely than it actually is. Does that make sense? All right, so that's availability. Now let's move on here. Let's try a couple things. Again, half your class, close your eyes. This time you guys close your eyes first. And I know I'm not doing sampling right, but I don't care. Okay? Maybe we'll switch it next time. All right? Over here. Nope, not you. This side. Keep your eyes closed on that side. This side. Over here. Come up with a percentage. You got a percentage written down? All right, close your eyes. This side, open up. Take a look at these things here. Do you understand what it's asking you to do? Come up with a percentage. Come up with a percentage. Come up with a percentage. I didn't eat breakfast, and that smells really good. This should be really stressful. All right, you guys got your estimates, your 3 estimates? Okay, let's try something here. Let's look first at this group. Give me some estimates of heart disease. What percentage? 30? Somebody else? 14? Did I hear 12, Mike? What's that? 23? 35? 40? Okay, let's just look at that real quick and say, what's kind of that average percentage that we see here? Probably high 20s, right? Somewhere in that. I'm just going to put 28, okay? Cancer, give me some percentages for cancer. 25? 15, 1-5. 30. 13. Anybody else? Estimate here is probably going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 20, probably right around 20, 21, 22, right? Okay. And then other natural causes. 42, 55, 17. How much? 40. Say it louder, guys. I can hear you. 50? 45. So the estimate here is going to be somewhere in the ballpark of probably, that's 50, that's 45, 42, probably right around 40, 38, somewhere around there, right? So 38, okay. All right, so let's look at that there. This group, give me some estimates of total natural causes. 80, 82, 89, 80, 40. Did I hear 40? 43, 80, 74. What's the percentage then that we're going to come up with here? Ballpark? Yeah, those ones threw us off. We're probably somewhere in the 70s because there's so many that are 80s or highers, right? Probably somewhere in the 70s, right? Let's just come up with a number. Let's just say 75. I don't know if that's accurate or not. Okay, you want to see what the, well, actually, so then let's just look at this real quick and see what we have evidence of here. What? Somebody do the math. What's 28 plus 21 plus 38? 87? So the sum of these that we have is 87%. What do we notice right now that's? Okay, but those 40s are there. What do we notice? That, because we know that these all have to make up that. Does that make sense, right? These are natural causes, these are natural causes, so all other natural causes, right? Probability theory. Probability of event A, probability of event B, and then this is all others in the sample space have to make up the sample space. So we notice then that the sum of the individual percentages is what? Higher than the estimate of the true percentage. Okay, we're going to get to that in a second, but let's look at the actual rates. And I'd say actual rates, these were 2007 rates that I could find. Oh, crap, okay. So they're not on there anymore, so I wish I could do it. So 33, 23, 36. And we had what? 28, 21, 38. Okay? 92%, 75%. So really what we're doing is we're underestimating the natural cause rate of the whole group. Okay? You think non-natural causes, accidents, and murder rates are that high? Wow. Okay? But what we're getting at here is something related to the concept of additivity. And that we make these errors sometimes based upon availability. Subadditivity occurs when we perceive the sum of the probabilities as being greater than the sample space, which would be greater than 1. Does that make sense? We demonstrated subadditivity. How? Exactly, and because natural causes became the sample space, right, the sum of the independent probabilities was greater than the estimate of the sample space itself. Okay? This in the book is what they refer to as Yogi Berra. We talked about him earlier, okay? If there's a 50% chance that we'll have a repeat winner, you got to remember there's also a 75% chance that we won't. It's kind of not possible, right? It's not possible. Why? Because there's not a 125% chance, right? These are mutually exclusive. If you have a repeat winner, then the opposite of that, the complement of that, is not having a repeat winner. So it has to add up to 1, right? But we tend to perceive certain events to be more likely than the rules of probability theory allow. Why? Because when it's asked specifically, heart disease, we now are probing for evidence of heart disease. Cancer, we're probing for evidence, right? And so now we're overestimating those things, which leads to an overestimate. We can also see something called subadditivity, which is the opposite, where we perceive the sum of all mutually exclusive events to be less than the sample space. This occurs when we get to things like this. If we can easily retrieve or imagine those individual probabilities, we result in estimating the individual probabilities to be greater than the whole. That's subadditivity. No, I don't. Okay. Whereas, if it's difficult to retrieve or we can't imagine the events easily, we underestimate the probabilities of those events compared to the whole. And that's the superadditivity. Okay? But that explains then also how availability runs its effect. Okay, but we see, again, this all comes back to what? Say it louder. You got a mouthful, I don't care, spit it out. Okay? If I can't eat, you can't eat. Fluency. It all comes back to fluency, right? How easily we can retrieve examples, either real from memory or imagine, the better we're going to be able to remember that. Or, excuse me, the higher the estimate. Excuse me. It's more fluent, the higher the estimate. Okay? So that's the last thing I wanted to say there. All right? Now let's move on and do a couple other things here because we only got 20 minutes left. We're going to go through a couple examples because I want to. All right? All right. Everybody together can do this. You don't have to, we're not going to split into groups. Which of these is a more likely event? You're playing roulette. 3 spins in a row come up 0, 0, 0. Or 3 spins come up 25, 17, and 4. Pick one. Which is more likely? Everybody got a decision? Okay. Just make a decision. Just make a decision. Don't ask questions. Okay. Well, I'm not asking you your decision yet. Just saying make one. Here's another one. You're rolling a die 3 times. What's more likely? Rolling 6, 6, 6, or rolling 5, 1, 4? All right. How many say in the first one, this is more likely? 0, 0, 0. How many say 25, 17, 4 is more likely? All right. Second one, how many say 6, 6, 6 is more likely? How many say 5, 1, 4 is more likely? All right. Now, some of you don't have your hands up. Why? Because they are all exactly the same probability. However, when those of you thought that one was more likely than the other, every single time you picked this one or this one as being the more likely one. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's try this one. Sarah loves to listen to New Age music and faithfully reads her horoscope each day. In her spare time, she enjoys aromatherapy and attending a local spirituality group. Is Sarah more likely to be a school teacher or a holistic healer? Pick one. How many say school teacher? How many say holistic healer? Okay, you have to pick one. There is no equally likely. Pick one. How many say school teacher? How many say holistic healer? Okay? Reality is Sarah is more likely to be what? A school teacher. We'll get to that. All right? But what we're starting to do now is introduce the representativeness heuristic. All right? Keep the Sarah problem in mind. Keep the 2 gambling problems in mind here. And according to the representativeness heuristic, it says we estimate the likelihood of something belonging to a certain group on the basis of what? Similarity to what? Not to ourselves. To our expectations of the group. Does that make sense? Right? So it's not ourselves. It could be ourselves if we're part of the group, but I don't want to say we're comparing it to ourselves. We're comparing it to our knowledge of what the group is. Okay? And what we mean by this is we make this assessment based upon how similar that new instances to our concept of the group. What do we mean by concept? A stereotype could be a concept, but a concept is not not all concepts are stereotypes, but all stereotypes are concepts. So let's clarify. What do we mean by a concept? Ideas of what? What the group is, right? A concept is our abstract representation of what it means to be part of that category, to be part of that group. A concept is not a member of that group. A concept is what it means to be part of that group, right? So what's your concept of bird? Flies, has wings, it has feathers, it lays eggs. Does that make sense? That's a concept. You can have many examples of birds, but an example is not a concept. A concept is your abstract representation of what it means to be part of that group. Does that make sense? Okay? So, let's try something else here. So, actually, let's go back for a second. Let's talk about the, so let's look back at the first one. Most of you said they're equally likely, which is true. They are equally likely. But for those that said one was more likely than the other, you picked that 25, 17, 4 was more likely than 0, 0, 0. Why? Because it seems more random, and our expectation is what? That spinning of a roulette wheel should be random. Right? So if I see the same three numbers come up in a row, that isn't perceived to be random to me. So therefore, it's less likely. Same thing for rolling a die and getting 6, 6, 6 in a row. We perceive that 5, 1, 4 is more likely because, why? It is perceived, it looks, it's more similar to what we would expect from something that's random. Okay? Let's look at the Sarah problem. Why did many of you think that she's a holistic healer? Because she likes aromatherapy. And she listens to New Age music. And she reads her horoscope every day. Right? And so, based upon that information, you think she's a holistic healer. Why? Similar to what? There you go. It's similar to what we think of when we think of a holistic healer. Okay? So let's try this one. All right? A certain town is served by 2 hospitals. In the larger hospital, about 45 babies are born each day. In the smaller hospital, about 15 babies are born each day. As you're completely aware, I hope you're completely aware, about 50% of all babies are boys. The other 50% are girls, okay? All right? The exact percentage, though, can vary from day to day, right? Sometimes it may be higher than 50%. Sometimes it may be lower than 50%. Does that make sense? Right? So, for a period of 1 year, each hospital recorded the days on which more than 60% of babies born were boys. Which hospital do you think had more days? Did the larger hospital have more days? Did the smaller hospital have more days? Or did they both are equally likely to have the same amount of days? Write down your decision. Larger, smaller, both. How many say larger? How many say smaller? How many say both equally likely? 3. The correct answer is smaller. First thing that influences the validity of the representativeness heuristic. Okay? Let's look at another thing. Imagine that I administered a test to 80 students here and 20 faculty members. Here's a description of one of the individuals. Jack's a 49-year-old man. He's married, has 1 child. Personally describes himself as a liberal intellectual and enjoys writing essays on social issues. He spends most of his free time on his many hobbies, which include reading, playing Sudoku, and photography. How likely is Jack to be a faculty member? Give me a percentage. Write down. Stop yelling these damn things out. Write it down. Anytime I do these, I want you to do it on your own. Okay? How likely is Jack to be a faculty member? Write it down. Okay? How many? Start throwing out some numbers. 20. I'm hearing 20. Anybody else? How much? 15? 25? Anybody else? What's that, Sam? 20? Anybody else? 25? Anybody else? What? 20? Anybody else? Throw it out. Everybody had to come up with something. Please, throw up. 20? 20? Okay. You guys suck. Okay. All right? All right. But the difference is you guys have already demonstrated this, so I don't have to rely on this one. I'm being smart and providing a couple examples now because you guys blow up other ones, okay? All right? The first thing that happens when judging by similarities is that we often ignore important statistical information. Okay? The first of these is sample size. We demonstrated this by those that thought that the hospitals were equally likely to have the same number of days of more boys than girls. Okay? And what we're being insensitive there is that a large sample is more likely to reflect the true proportions than a small sample. Okay? So you sit there and say, well, the 50% is the likelihood, so both hospitals, 50% is 50% regardless. Right? But that's not what the question's asking. It's saying which one is more likely to be 50% on a daily basis. The larger sample is more likely to reflect the true population than the smaller sample. So therefore, the smaller sample is more likely to be way off kilter. Does that make sense? This is something we refer to as the small sample fallacy, where we tend to assume that small samples are representative of the population. Now, some of you were smart enough to realize, oh no, it's a small hospital, because you may have seen this problem before, and you think you're so savvy. However, we do this all the time because this small sample fallacy is the basis for stereotype formation. It's the basis for inductive reasoning. We make an estimate of the whole from a small sample, and we think that that small sample represents the whole. So all of you self-righteous people sitting in here thinking that, I did it right. It's basic math. I know it. The small sample, I'm sensitive to that. We demonstrate it every single day. Right? In stereotype formation, we see evidence of this. The other thing is base rate that we aren't sensitive to. The base rate is basically how often an item actually occurs in the population. Now, on the problem I just gave you, I told you the base rates, right? What were the base rates? 80% students, 20% faculty. So most of you said, oh, in that problem, I know I have to pay attention to the base rates. And it's obvious, it's right in my face. So I'm going to say 20% because why is he giving me that information if it isn't important? Right? But let's go back for a second. Let's look at that Sarah problem. How many of you said Sarah is a holistic healer? No, look how so few hands are coming up now. Right? But by making that judgment, you're not being sensitive to what? The base rates of teachers and holistic healers in society. What is much more likely? Teachers, right? A teacher compared to a holistic healer, or if we want to limit it to females, female teachers are much more likely than female holistic healers. But you didn't even pay attention to that, right? That's what we call the base rate fallacy, where you overemphasize similarity and you ignore or underemphasize base rates. We could see underemphasis in the last example, the faculty-student example, right? Where people might sit there and say, okay, well, I know that only 20% are faculty, but this sounds a whole lot like a faculty member, so I'm going to say 40%. Right? Well, you're underemphasizing the base rate. Does that make sense? Okay? Because you're saying it's so similar to what I would expect of a faculty member that it's underemphasizing this. And we see this in the famous study they talk about in the book of the engineer and lawyer study. All right. We're not going to get through all this today, but let's go through a couple other things. This one you guys have already seen, so I'm not even really worried about this one much. This is the Linda the bank teller problem. You guys read this in the book, right? Okay, so we're not even going to do this one. But let's look at this here. And the Linda the bank teller problem is an example of another limitation of judging by similarity, in that we don't accurately assess the likelihood of compound events. What's a compound event? Two things co-occurring, right? So in the Linda the bank teller problem, the compound event is bank teller and activist in the feminist movement. And what we tend to find, and I didn't do it with you because you already read about it would be a waste, right? But if you do it to people that don't know it, they will say that Linda is more likely to be a bank teller that's active in the feminist movement than she is to be a bank teller. But that's absolutely impossible. It's not even improbable. It's absolutely impossible to be more likely to be a bank teller and active in the feminist movement than just a bank teller. And the reason for this is because the probability of compound events. The conjunction of two events cannot be more probable than the probability of either event individually. What do we mean by this is, if the probability of A is less than 1 and the probability of B is less than 1, then by definition, the probability of those two things together always has to be less than the probability of either one. What's 0.9 times 0.9? 0.81. Is 0.81 less than 0.9? Is it less, right? What's 0.9 times 0.8? 0.72. Is 0.72 less than 0.9? Is 0.72 less than 0.8? Right? The probability always has to be less. And what we get at here, the other way to think about this is a Venn diagram. If this is your entire sample space, the white box, anything in the orange is event A. Anything in blue is event B. It's impossible for the combination of these two to be greater than any of those one by itself. Now, you may sit there and say, well, what about if one is subsumed by the other? Right? It would be equal to the probability of one, but it can never be greater than the probability. That's what we mean. It can never be greater than the probability. And that's why we clarified right here is, if the probabilities of these are less than 1, then it will always be less. If the probability of one of those is equal to 1, then it will never be greater than the other one. Right? Because if we say that the probability of B is 1, then what's the probability of A and B? No. If the probability of B is 1, what's the probability of both A and B occurring? The probability of A. Because what's the probability of A times 1? Just the probability of A. Does that make sense? Another way to think of this, and let me just draw it real quick for you, okay? That's weird. Okay? Right? So if we had a situation here where, let's say that this is A, and let's say that this is B. Does that make sense? Okay. The probability of B is 1. The probability of A and B, does that make sense? Right? If we sample A plus B, we know we're definitely getting B. Right? So then the probability of A plus B, this cancels out. It's just the probability of that. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's finish up by asking these couple ones for you. Which of these is more likely? An all-out nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia, or an all-out nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia in which neither country intends to use nuclear weapons, but both sides, blah, 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 blah. Who says A is more likely? So we're looking here at about probably 80% of class. Oops, son of a... Who says B is more likely? Right? We're looking right now at about 80% now versus 20%. Why is A more likely? Because less has to happen? Possibly, but that's not the reason it's more likely in this example. Not less variables. I mean, you're right, there's less that has to happen, there's less variables, but not in this example. The reason why A is more likely is because what? Think of probability theory. Why is A more likely? What? You're right. I mean, these are reasons why it could be, but it's not according to what we just talked about. Why is A more likely? Think back to the last slide. A or B, independently, right? Let's take a look at this. Is B just a compound event involving A? Does that make sense? What I'm saying? This is exactly the Linda the bank teller problem. Linda's a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and a feminist. Does that make sense? This is an example here then of, if I could draw the diagram, let me draw the diagram here real quick. Come on, what is going on here? Okay, if we draw the diagram real quick, this can be all nuclear wars with Russia. I know it looks really good, right? Oops, come on. I know we want to get out of here, so I'm just trying to draw this real quick. This can be all wars caused by Pakistan and so on, right? War caused by third country. I know that doesn't look good, but that's fine, okay? War caused by third, okay? The number of wars that's caused, number of nuclear wars caused by a third party has to be less than the number of nuclear wars caused between Russia and the U.S. Does that make sense? It has to be. It has to be. And so although you're all really familiar with the Linda the bank teller problem, you say, well, I wouldn't fall victim to that. 77% of you on the survey at the beginning of the quarter picked B as being more likely than A, although it's statistically impossible. Does that make sense? This is demonstrating the problem, one of the problems we have with representativeness is that we aren't sensitive to probability theory. We aren't sensitive to statistics by judging based upon similarity, because it's more rational, right? That if we're going to get into a war with Russia, it's going to be because some third nation drags us into that war, right? We're not just going to get into war. The Cold War is over. It's going to be because of the Ukraine or something like that, right? So this makes more sense, so we judge this as being more probable, but statistically speaking, according to probability theory, it can't be. All right? We're not sensitive to these things, and this is what can lead us to make what we might call irrational decisions. Okay? Let's finish with that there. On Monday, we're going to finish up going through just a couple other examples here, and then we're going to make sure you read chapter 6, where we're going to start talking about the story model. Okay?